I stood in my own kitchen, looking at my wife's face, and I realized I didn't recognize her anymore. She had her arms crossed, her jaw tight, and she said the words I'll never forget. Apologize to my son right now, or we're getting a divorce. Her voice wasn't just loud, it was sharp, like she'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks. Dylan stood behind her, leaning against the doorframe with his phone in his hand, smirking like he'd already won some kind of game I didn't even know we were playing. The kitchen was dead silent except for the hum of the fridge and the ticking of the old wall clock my dad gave me years ago. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. This wasn't the first time Karen had defended Dylan, but it was the first time she'd made it an ultimatum. I looked at her, then at him, and I felt something break inside me, not in a loud, dramatic way, but quietly, like ice cracking under weight. Dylan was 26 years old, hadn't worked in over a year, and had been living in our house rent-free because Karen said he needed time to figure things out. Time to figure things out had turned into time to drain our savings, eat our food, leave dishes in the sink, and treat me like I was some kind of obstacle in his life. And Karen? She let him. Every single time. When I suggested Dylan get a job, she said I was being too hard on him. When I asked him to help with the yard work, she said I was being controlling. When I told her we couldn't afford to keep covering his car insurance, his phone bill, and his nights out with friends, she looked at me like I was the villain. But this time was different. This time, Dylan had crossed a line I didn't even know existed. We'd been sitting at the dinner table earlier that evening, the three of us, and I'd made a comment about responsibility. Nothing harsh, just something like, if you want respect, you have to earn it. Dylan laughed, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "At least my real dad didn't abandon me like yours did." I felt my stomach drop. My father passed away when I was 17. He didn't abandon anyone. He died in a car accident on his way home from work. Dylan knew that. Karen knew that. And she said nothing. She just looked down at her plate and kept eating like he'd commented on the weather. That moment, watching her cut her chicken and avoid my eyes, told me everything I needed to know about where I stood in this house. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the table. I just stood up, walked to the kitchen, and started washing dishes because I didn't trust myself to speak. That's when Karen followed me in and delivered the ultimatum. She wanted me to apologize to Dylan for making him feel uncomfortable. Not for what he said about my dead father. For what I said about responsibility. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I tried to remember the woman I married. The one who laughed at my bad jokes, who cried during commercials, who used to tell me I was the only person who ever made her feel safe. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who treated me like a checkbook, a handyman, a backup plan. I thought about all the times I'd bent over backwards for Dylan. When he got fired from his second job in 6 months, I helped him update his resume, spent 3 hours reformatting it while he played video games in the next room. When he wrecked his car doing donuts in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, I paid for the repairs because Karen cried and said he'd learned his lesson. When he got kicked out of his apartment for not paying rent, I was the one who suggested he move in with us. Even though Karen never asked, she just told me he was coming and expected me to make it work. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was being a good husband, a good stepfather. But Dylan never thanked me. Not once. And Karen never stood up for me. Not once. So when she gave me that ultimatum, when she stood there with her arms crossed and her face full of certainty, I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't beg. I just looked her in the eyes and said 3 words. I'm done here. The confidence drained from her face for just a second, like she didn't expect me to actually choose. Dylan's smirk flickered. Karen opened her mouth to say something. Maybe to walk it back, maybe to double down, but I was already moving. I went upstairs, grabbed a duffel bag from the closet, and started packing. Clothes, toothbrush, phone charger, the basics. My hands were shaking, but I kept moving because I knew if I stopped, I'd second-guess myself. I could hear Karen's footsteps on the stairs, then her voice from the hallway, telling me not to be dramatic, to come downstairs so we could talk about this. But I wasn't being dramatic. I was being clear. For the first time in 5 years, I was setting a boundary that actually meant something. I zipped the bag, slung it over my shoulder, and walked past her without a word. Dylan was still in the kitchen, scrolling on his phone like nothing had happened. I walked out the front door, got in my truck, and sat there for a minute with the engine running. The house lights were on. I could see Karen standing in the window, watching me. She wasn't crying. She wasn't chasing me. She was just standing there, probably thinking I'd come back in 10 minutes with my tail between my legs like I always did. But I didn't. I put the truck in reverse, backed out of the driveway, and drove away. It was cold that night, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, and I didn't have a plan. I didn't have anywhere to go. I just knew I couldn't stay in that house for one more second. I ended up at Ray's place, my buddy from the VFW. He opened the door in his bathrobe, took one look at me standing there with my duffel bag, and said, "Come on in." He didn't ask questions. He just pointed me to the couch, handed me a beer, and let me sit in silence. That night, lying on Ray's couch with my phone buzzing every few minutes, I realized something. Karen and Dylan thought I'd come crawling back. They thought I needed them more than they needed me. And maybe, for a long time, I believed that too. But as I stared at the ceiling, listening to the heat kick on and the sound of Ray snoring in the next room, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Control. I wasn't going back. I woke up on Ray's couch with my neck stiff and my phone screen lit up like a Christmas tree. 17 missed calls. 23 text messages. All from Karen. I didn't open them right away. I just stared at the notifications, watching them pile up in real time, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power. Ray was already up, making coffee in the kitchen, and when I walked in he just nodded and slid a mug across the counter. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. He'd been through a divorce himself about 10 years back, messy one with a woman who tried to take his truck and his dog, and he knew better than to ask questions this early. I finally opened the messages around 8 in the morning. The first few were almost sweet, like she was testing the waters, asking me to come home so we could talk. Then they got defensive, calling me childish and saying I was overreacting. Then angry, accusing me of walking out on my family and abandoning my responsibilities. Then desperate, saying Dylan was upset and didn't mean it, begging me to come back and fix this like I always did. I read every single one, and I didn't respond to any of them. That silence. That was the first real boundary I'd set in 5 years. By noon, she'd switched tactics. She sent me a message saying her lawyer told her I couldn't just freeze her out of the house, and that we'd see what the court says about a man who abandons his wife. I almost laughed. She thought I'd frozen her out. She thought I'd abandoned the house. But I hadn't touched anything. I just left. The difference was, she didn't know how anything actually worked. She didn't know which account the mortgage came out of. She didn't know I'd refinanced the house 2 years ago to pay off her credit card debt from when she went on that shopping spree with her sister. She didn't know I'd been the only one making real financial decisions for the last half-decade, while she nodded along and signed wherever I pointed. And now? Now she was about to find out. I spent that afternoon at the credit union downtown, the one on Oak Street where I'd done all our banking for the past 8 years. I didn't go in angry. I went in calm, with a clear head, and I asked to speak with someone about protecting my assets during a separation. The woman behind the desk, Linda, had helped me with the refinance before, and she understood immediately. She was maybe 55, gray hair pulled back, the kind of person who'd seen every financial disaster a marriage could produce. She pulled up my accounts, walked me through everything, and explained that since the house and the primary checking account were in my name, I had every right to freeze joint access temporarily while we sorted things out legally. Standard procedure during a separation, she said, happens all the time. Then she told me something I didn't know. 2 days before I left, there'd been an attempted charge on our credit card for $6,000. The charge was declined because we didn't have the limit, but it had triggered a fraud alert. I asked what it was for. She pulled up the details, and I watched her face shift slightly when she read it. A down payment on a boat. Not a small fishing boat, either. A 22-foot Sea Ray from a dealer 2 towns over. Dylan. He'd tried to buy a boat with our credit card without asking anyone. Without even checking if we had the money. Karen probably didn't even know. Or worse, maybe she did and figured I'd just handle it like I handled everything else. I left the credit union with copies of every document I needed, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. I wasn't the bad guy here. I was the only one who'd been paying attention. That evening, my phone started ringing again. This time it was Dylan. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail, and his voice came through high-pitched and panicked, completely different from his usual cocky tone. He was asking what the hell I did, saying his card wasn't working, his mom's card wasn't working, and they couldn't even get gas. There was noise in the background, like he was at a gas station, and I could hear Karen's voice too, sharp and frantic. Ray looked at me and raised an eyebrow. I just shrugged. I hadn't done anything. I just stopped doing everything. The calls kept coming. Karen called 6 more times that night. Then Dylan called again. Then Karen texted saying I was being vindictive and this wasn't like me, that I was punishing her for trying to protect her son. I stared at that message for a long time. She was right. It wasn't like me. The old me would have caved by now. The old me would have apologized just to keep the peace, would have transferred money into the account and pretended nothing happened. The old me would have driven home, sat down at the kitchen table, and let her lecture me about being a better man while Dylan smirked in the background and went back to playing games on his phone. But I wasn't that guy anymore. Ray noticed I was staring at my phone and asked if I was thinking about going back. I didn't answer right away. Honestly, part of me was. Part of me wanted to believe that if I just explained it the right way, Karen would finally see what she'd been doing. That she'd realize Dylan had been using both of us. That she'd choose me. But then Ray told me a story. He said his cousin had been in a situation like this years ago, married to a woman with 2 grown kids who treated him like an ATM. The guy bent over backwards trying to prove he was good enough, paid for their cars, their insurance, their rent when they got evicted. One day the woman told him if he didn't like it, he could leave. So he did. And you know what happened? She took him to court, took half his pension, and her kids got lawyer money out of the settlement. The guy ended up in a studio apartment with nothing but a futon and a TV, eating ramen at 60 years old. Ray looked at me with those tired veteran eyes and said one thing that changed everything. Don't be that guy. I deleted the apology I'd been typing. The next morning, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and it was Karen's sister, the one who'd never liked me, who always made comments about how Karen could have done better. She didn't even say hello, just launched into how Karen was a mess, how Dylan was freaking out, and how I needed to come home and be an adult about this instead of running away like a child. I let her finish, let her get it all out, and then I said one sentence. If Karen wants to talk, we can do it in front of a mediator. She went quiet. Then she asked if I was really going to make this official, if I was really going to drag this through lawyers and courts like some kind of vindictive ex. I told her Karen already made it official when she chose her son over her husband, and I hung up. That was the moment I knew I wasn't going back. Not to the house. Not to the fights. Not to the version of myself that believed love meant letting people walk all over you. Ray's couch became my base for the next 2 days. I contacted a lawyer, a guy named Tom who'd helped Ray with his divorce, started organizing paperwork, and ignored every message that wasn't about scheduling a formal conversation. Karen's texts went from angry to confused to something that almost looked like regret. One of them said she didn't think I'd actually leave, that she thought I loved her more than this. I stared at that message for a long time. She didn't think I'd leave. That was the whole problem. She thought I'd always be there, no matter what she did, no matter how many times she chose Dylan over me. And maybe I would have been, if she hadn't made me choose between my self-respect and her son. But she did, and I chose myself. On the 3rd night, Karen sent one more message saying fine, we'd meet with someone, but this was on me, that I was the one tearing this family apart. I didn't reply. I just forwarded the message to Tom and asked him to set it up. Public, neutral, witnesses. Because I was done having conversations where I was the only one being honest. The mediation office was in a small building downtown, the kind of place with beige walls, fluorescent lights, and uncomfortable chairs that made you want to leave as soon as you walked in. I got there 15 minutes early and sat in my truck, watching people walk by on the sidewalk, trying to steady my breathing. My lawyer, Tom, met me in the parking lot. He was maybe 60, gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and he had this calm presence like nothing could rattle him. He gave me a simple piece of advice. Stay calm, stick to the facts, and let the documents do the talking. People expect you to yell, he said. When you don't, they start listening. Karen showed up 10 minutes late with Dylan in tow. I watched them through the window as they got out of her car, and I could see she'd been crying. Her eyes were red. Her hair wasn't done the way she usually did it, and she looked smaller somehow, like the weight of the last few days had finally hit her. Dylan looked angry, his jaw tight, his hands shoved in his pockets. They didn't look at each other as they walked in, and I noticed Dylan was wearing the jacket I'd bought him last Christmas, the expensive Carhartt one he'd begged for. The mediator was a woman in her 50s named Patricia, and she had that calm, no-nonsense energy that made you feel like she'd heard every excuse in the book. She sat us down at a table, Karen and Dylan on one side, me and Tom on the other, and she laid out the ground rules. No interrupting, no yelling, and everything we said stayed in this room unless we decided otherwise. Then she asked who wanted to speak first. Karen started talking before Patricia even finished the question, and her voice cracked almost immediately. She said she never thought it would come to this. She said she was just trying to protect her son because he'd been through so much with his real father leaving when he was young, and she thought I'd understand because I knew what it was like to lose a parent. She said I'd changed, that I wasn't the man she married, and that walking out was cruel and unfair to both of them. I didn't interrupt. I just let her talk. When she was done, Patricia asked if I wanted to respond. I did. I told her I didn't walk out on her. I walked out on a situation where I wasn't respected, where my boundaries didn't matter, and where I was expected to apologize for things I didn't do wrong. I explained the ultimatum, word for word. I explained the insult about my father, how Dylan had said my dad abandoned me when he died in a car accident, and Karen's silence when it happened. I told her about the boat, about the $6,000 charge Dylan tried to make 2 days before I left, and about the years of covering his expenses while he contributed nothing and treated me like an intruder in my own home. Tom slid the credit union documents across the table. Bank statements, the fraud alert notification, the attempted boat purchase with our card number and Dylan's name on the dealer's form. Patricia looked them over, her expression unchanging, then looked at Karen. Karen's face went pale. She hadn't known about the boat. She turned to Dylan, and for the first time I saw doubt in her eyes, like maybe she was starting to see what I'd been seeing all along. Dylan shifted in his chair, and for the first time since we'd sat down, he looked uncomfortable. Patricia asked him directly if he'd tried to make that purchase. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice was defensive, saying it wasn't a big deal, that he was going to pay it back eventually, that I was just making him look bad because I never wanted him there in the first place. Patricia didn't react. She just wrote something down and moved on. The conversation shifted to finances, to the house, to what came next. Tom explained that the accounts had been frozen temporarily to prevent unauthorized charges, not to punish anyone, and that everything could be unfrozen once we had a clear agreement in place about who was responsible for what. Karen asked why I didn't just talk to her about this instead of bringing lawyers into it, why I had to make everything so formal and cold. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I said something I'd been holding in for years, because every time I tried to talk, you made me the bad guy. My voice stayed level, but I felt the weight of those words in my chest. She didn't have an answer for that. She just looked down at her hands. Dylan tried to jump in, saying I'd always treated him like a burden, that I never wanted him there, that I was using this as an excuse to control his mom and make her choose between us. I stayed calm. I told him I'd helped him more times than I could count, that I'd opened my home to him when he had nowhere else to go, that I'd paid for things his own mother couldn't afford. I said the only thing I ever asked for in return was basic respect, and he couldn't even give me that. I told him he didn't owe me anything anymore, but he didn't get to rewrite history and pretend I was the villain. Patricia stepped in before it could escalate. She asked Karen what she wanted moving forward. Karen said she wanted things to go back to normal, that we could work this out if I just came home, that we could set boundaries for Dylan and make it work this time. I shook my head. I told her normal wasn't something I wanted to go back to. I said I'd spent 5 years trying to hold everything together while she chose Dylan over me every single time, and I was done pretending that was okay. I told her I'd given her chance after chance to see what was happening, and she'd chosen to ignore it every time because it was easier than dealing with Dylan. Patricia asked if I wanted a divorce. I said I didn't know yet, but I knew I wasn't going back to that house. Tom suggested a formal separation agreement, something that would divide responsibilities and give everyone space to figure out what came next. Karen looked at me like she was waiting for me to change my mind, to say I was sorry, to fix it like I always did. But I didn't. I just nodded at Tom and told him to draw up the paperwork. The meeting ended an hour later. Karen tried to talk to me in the parking lot, but I told her everything from here on out needed to go through the lawyers. Dylan didn't even look at me. He just got in the car and slammed the door hard enough to make the whole car shake. I drove back to Ray's place, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. It took 2 months to finalize everything. The house stayed in my name, but I agreed to give Karen a settlement to help her get back on her feet, enough to cover first and last month's rent somewhere and get her started. Dylan moved out of state to stay with a friend in Arizona, and from what I heard through the grapevine, he actually got a job at a warehouse and was starting to figure things out. Apparently being away from his mom made him grow up a little. Karen sent me a few messages in the weeks after, nothing angry, just sad. She said she wished things had been different, that she understood now what she'd done. I told her I did too. I moved into a small apartment across town, the kind of place with 1 bedroom, a tiny kitchen, and a view of the parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No yelling, no tension, no walking on eggshells wondering when the next fight would start. I started going to the VFW more often, started fishing again on the weekends, started feeling like myself. Ray told me one night over beers that I'd done the right thing, that walking away from something that's breaking you isn't quitting, it's surviving. A few months later, Karen reached out one more time. She said she understood now, that she'd been so afraid of losing Dylan that she'd lost me instead. She said she should have stood up for me, should have set boundaries with him years ago, but she'd been too scared he'd leave like his father did. I didn't respond right away. When I finally did, I told her I didn't hate her, but I couldn't go back. Some bridges, once burned, don't get rebuilt. And that was okay. I learned something through all of this. Peace isn't something you beg for. It's something you choose. And sometimes, choosing peace means walking away from people who'll never understand why you had to. What do you think about this story? Let me know in the comments, drop a like, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories.